6 months after the recovery of her heirlooms, Camilla stood in her private sitting room at Clarence's house, carefully arranging the jewelry in a new display case that had been specially designed for their protection. The case was made of reinforced glass with an advanced security system that would alert authorities immediately if anyone attempted to tamper with it. But despite these modern precautions, the case was also beautiful, designed to showcase the pieces while keeping them safe, allowing them to be seen and appreciated rather than locked away in darkness. She had learned that security and accessibility could coexist, that protecting what you love did not mean hiding it from the world. The experience had changed her in ways both subtle and profound. She found herself more appreciative of the present moment, less likely to take things for granted. The faces of her family members seemed more precious now, their time together more valuable. She had learned viscerally what she had always known intellectually, that material possessions, no matter how beloved, were ultimately temporary, that they could be lost in an instant. But she had also learned that sometimes, if you are very lucky and very persistent, what is lost can be found again. The months of grief and uncertainty had taught her resilience she did not know she possessed, had shown her that she could survive even the loss of things she had believed were essential to her sense of self and family continuity. Charles noticed the change in his wife, the way she seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. They walked together through the gardens more frequently now, Camilla stopping to notice details she might have overlooked before, the way light filtered through leaves, the scent of roses in the morning air, the sound of birds calling to each other across the green spaces. She had developed a new perspective on what truly mattered, understanding in a deeper way that experiences and relationships were the real heirlooms, the things that could not be stolen by any thief, no matter how clever or bold. The physical objects were important, yes, but they derived their meaning from the love that had surrounded them across generations. Laura and her children visited more often, drawn by Camilla's renewed energy and presence. The grandchildren loved hearing stories about the jewelry and the dramatic adventure of its recovery. They begged Camilla to tell and retell the tale of the hidden room, the undercover officers, the dramatic arrest, each retelling polishing the story until it took on the quality of family legend. Camilla obliged them, but she also used these moments to teach them deeper lessons about trust, about the importance of protecting what you value, about resilience in the face of loss. She wanted them to understand that the jewelry's real value lay not in the pearls and sapphires themselves, but in what they represented, the love and strength of the women who had worn them before. Detective Morrison remained in contact with Camilla even after the case was officially closed. They had formed an unexpected friendship during those months of investigation, bonded by shared purpose and the emotional intensity of the search. Morrison occasionally visited for tea, updating Camilla on other cases she was working on, other stolen treasures she was trying to recover for other families. Camilla supported Morrison's work however she could, using her position to raise awareness about art theft and the importance of protecting cultural and family heritage. She gave speeches at charity events, wrote articles for specialized publications, becoming an advocate for victims of theft who often felt forgotten once the initial police reports were filed. The publicity surrounding the case had one unexpected benefit. Other victims who had given up hope of recovering their stolen possessions began to reinvestigate their cases, encouraged by Camilla's successful recovery. Several cold cases were reopened, leading to the discovery of additional stolen items and the arrest of other criminals operating in the underground antiquities market. Camilla received letters from people all over the country, thanking her for not giving up, for showing that persistence could sometimes lead to justice and restoration. These letters touched her deeply, reminding her that her grief and struggle had not been in vain, that her story had given hope to others who were still searching for their own lost treasures. She began a new tradition within her family, gathering everyone together once a year on the anniversary of the jewelry's recovery. During these gatherings, she would tell the stories associated with each piece, ensuring that the next generation understood their significance. The children were allowed to carefully handle the items under supervision, to feel their weight and texture, to understand that these were not museum pieces to be kept distant and untouchable, but living parts of their family history. Laura took photographs during these gatherings, documenting each child holding each piece, creating a visual record that would itself become an heirloom. proof of continuity and connection across time. Camilla also made a practical decision that reflected her newfound wisdom. She had all the jewelry properly appraised and insured, with detailed photographs and documentation stored in multiple secure locations. She created a detailed provenance record for each piece, including its history, previous owners, and the story of its recovery. This documentation would ensure that future generations would know exactly what they possessed and why it mattered. She also updated her will to specify exactly who would receive each piece, eliminating any potential for confusion or conflict after her death. These were practical measures, but they were also acts of love, ways of protecting her family from the uncertainty and loss she had experienced. The gold locket became her favorite piece, the one she wore most often. Something about the ordeal it had survived made it even more precious to her. She had the photograph of her father restored professionally, ensuring it would last for many more decades. She sometimes opened the locket during quiet moments, looking at his face, feeling the connection across the years to a man who had loved her unconditionally and taught her about integrity and resilience. She liked to think he would have been proud of how she handled the theft and recovery, how she had refused to give up hope even when it seemed futile, how she had emerged from the experience stronger and more appreciative of life's blessings. On particularly meaningful occasions, Camilla wore all the recovered pieces at once, a personal celebration of their return. The pearl necklace graced her throat, the sapphire brooch gleamed on her jacket, the rings adorned her fingers, and the locket rested against her heart. She felt surrounded by the love of generations, protected and encouraged by the spirits of the strong women who had come before her. These occasions were private, shared only with her closest family, moments of gratitude and connection that required no public audience. In these moments, she understood completely that she was not just a guardian of objects, but a keeper of stories, a living link in a chain that stretched backward into history and forward into a future she would never see, but could help to shape through her choices and values. The experience taught her that loss, while painful, is not always permanent, that what seems irretrievably gone can sometimes find its way back. But it also taught her not to wait for loss to appreciate what she had, to treasure each moment with the people and things she loved while they were still present. She became known within her family for her habit of pausing during gatherings to simply look around, taking in the scene, memorizing faces and laughter, consciously creating memories that no thief could ever steal. Her children and grandchildren sometimes teased her about this habit, but they also understood it, and some of them began to do the same, learning from her example to pay attention, to be present, to appreciate the ordinary miracle of being together. Years would pass, and the story of the stolen and recovered heirlooms would become a treasured family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The jewelry itself would continue to pass from mother to daughter, each woman adding her own stories and experiences to the accumulated history. But the lesson Camilla learned during those difficult months remained constant, written not just in her heart but in the very fabric of her family's understanding of what truly matters. Love endures, family persists, some losses can be recovered, and when they are, they become more precious than before. And in the end, what we pass on to future generations is not just objects, no matter how beautiful or valuable, but the stories that give those objects meaning, the love that transforms mere possessions into sacred trust, the understanding that we are all part of something larger than ourselves, connected across time by bonds that no thief can ever break. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand halls of Clarence House as Camilla stood before her dressing table, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for her grandmother's pearl necklace. It was not there. The velvet-lined drawer where she had kept it for decades lay empty, save for a thin layer of dust that seemed to mock her confusion. She blinked twice, certain her eyes were playing tricks on her. The pearls had been there just last week when she had shown them to her daughter Laura during their afternoon tea. Camilla's heart began to race as she pulled open another drawer, then another. Her mother's sapphire brooch was missing. The antique cameo ring that had belonged to her great-aunt was gone. Even the simple gold locket containing a photograph of her beloved father had vanished without a trace. She sank onto the velvet stool, her reflection in the ornate mirror showing a woman who suddenly looked much older than her years. These were not just pieces of jewelry. They were fragments of her history, threads that connected her to the women who had come before her, each piece carrying stories of love, loss, and resilience. The royal family had always been surrounded by precious objects, but these items were different. They were not part of the crown jewels or state property. They were hers, deeply personal treasures that had nothing to do with her title or position. The pearl necklace had been worn by her grandmother on her wedding day in 1920. Her mother had clasped that very same strand around her own neck when she married Camilla's father. Camilla herself had worn it on the day she married Charles, a private moment of connection to the women who had shaped her life. Now it was simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. She called for her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, a trusted companion who had been with her for over 15 years. Margaret arrived within minutes, her face creased with concern as she took in Camilla's pale complexion and the open drawers scattered around the room. Together they searched every corner of the private apartments. They looked under furniture, inside coat pockets, behind curtains, and in places where the items could never logically have ended up. But there was nothing. The heirlooms had disappeared as completely as if they had been swallowed by the very walls of the historic building. Word of the missing items spread quietly through the household staff. Everyone was questioned discreetly, from the housekeepers who cleaned the rooms to the security personnel who monitored the corridors. No one had seen anything unusual. No unauthorized persons had been spotted in the private quarters. The security cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary. It was as if the jewelry had simply decided to vanish on its own, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense of unease that settled over Clarence's house like a cold fog. As the days passed, Camilla found herself unable to focus on her royal duties. During public appearances, she smiled and waved, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the past few weeks, searching for any clue she might have missed. At night, she lay awake, thinking about her grandmother's hands fastening the pearl clasp, her mother's voice telling stories about each precious piece. These objects were more than gold and gemstones. They were the only tangible links she had to a past that seemed to grow more distant with each passing year. The loss affected her more deeply than she had expected. Charles noticed the change in her demeanor, the way she would pause mid-conversation, her eyes distant and sad. He held her hand during their evening walks through the gardens, offering comfort but knowing that nothing he said could fill the void left by the missing heirlooms. The items had been uninsured for their sentimental value, only their monetary worth. How could one put a price on memories, on the feeling of connection to loved ones who had long since passed? Palace officials suggested that perhaps the items had been misplaced during a recent reorganization of her private rooms. But Camilla knew better. She had a system, a specific place for everything. These were pieces she looked at regularly, touched often, pieces that brought her comfort during difficult days. She had not misplaced them. Someone or something had taken them, and the thought filled her with a mixture of anger and profound sadness that she struggled to hide from the world, watching her every move. The investigation began in earnest, though it was conducted with the utmost discretion. The last thing anyone wanted was for the press to catch wind of missing jewelry from a royal residence. Detectives arrived in unmarked cars, dressed in civilian clothes, blending in with the household staff as they conducted their inquiries. They interviewed everyone who had access to the private quarters, examined entry logs, and reviewed hours of security footage. Yet despite their thorough efforts, they found no evidence of theft, no signs of forced entry, no indication of how or when the items had disappeared. Camilla began to wonder if she was losing her mind. Had she moved the items herself and forgotten? Was her memory beginning to fail her? These doubts plagued her during quiet moments, adding a layer of personal fear to the grief she already felt. Margaret reassured her repeatedly that she was not imagining things, that the jewelry had indeed been there, that multiple people had seen it. But doubt once planted is a difficult weed to uproot, and Camilla found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her own mind and memory. The emotional toll was visible to those who knew her well. Her children noticed how their mother's usual warmth seemed dimmed, how she would drift off during conversations, her gaze fixed on something only she could see. Laura visited more frequently, bringing photographs of happier times, trying to remind her mother that the memories themselves could not be stolen, that the love represented by those objects existed independently of the physical items. But Camilla would only smile sadly, nodding in agreement while her heart ached for the tangible connection she had lost, perhaps forever. 3 weeks had passed since the discovery of the missing heirlooms, and the investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison sat in a small office within Clarence House, surrounded by files and photographs, her coffee growing cold as she reviewed the case for what felt like the 100th time. She had worked many cases involving missing valuables, but this one was different. The absence of any evidence whatsoever was almost more suspicious than finding too much. It was as if whoever had taken the items knew exactly how to avoid detection. Or perhaps, she thought darkly, there was no theft at all. The detective had conducted extensive interviews with every member of the household staff, from the most senior advisors to the newest kitchen assistant. Each person had been thoroughly vetted, their backgrounds checked, their movements on the relevant days accounted for. No one had a criminal record. No one appeared to be living beyond their means or showed any signs of sudden wealth. The security team had been equally cooperative, providing access to all surveillance footage and entry records. Yet none of it led anywhere. The jewelry had simply ceased to exist within the walls of Clarence House. Camilla had begun attending fewer public engagements, citing minor health concerns that were not entirely fabricated. The stress of the missing items had indeed taken a physical toll. She found it difficult to sleep, often waking in the early hours of the morning with her heart racing, convinced she had remembered some crucial detail, only to have it slip away like water through her fingers. Charles urged her to see a doctor, worried about her health, but she refused. How could she explain to a physician that her ailment was not physical but spiritual, a deep wound caused by the severing of her connection to her family's past? Meanwhile, whispers had begun to circulate among certain members of the household. Some suggested that the items had never been stolen at all, that perhaps Camilla had gifted them to family members and forgotten, or that they had been moved to secure storage and the paperwork had been lost. Others, more cynical, wondered if the whole affair was some elaborate insurance fraud, though this theory made little sense given that the items had never been properly insured for their true value. The rumors, though spoken in hushed tones, found their way to Camilla's ears, adding humiliation to her grief. Laura had taken it upon herself to search through family records, hoping to find any documentation that might provide clues about the missing pieces. She spent hours in the library at her mother's country estate, pulling out old photograph albums, reading through letters written by her grandmother and great-grandmother, looking for any mention of the jewelry or where it might have been kept during various periods of family history. In one faded photograph from 1965, she found her grandmother wearing the pearl necklace at a garden party, the strand gleaming against her summer dress. The image made Laura's throat tighten with emotion as she realized how many generations had treasured these pieces. The investigation took an unexpected turn when a junior housekeeper named Emma approached Detective Morrison with information she had been too frightened to share earlier. Emma had been working late one evening about a month before the jewelry went missing, cleaning the corridor outside Camilla's private rooms. She had heard voices inside, which was unusual for that time of night. One voice was definitely Camilla's, but the other was male and unfamiliar. The conversation had sounded heated, though Emma could not make out specific words. She had thought nothing of it at the time, assuming it was some official business, but now she wondered if it might be relevant. Detective Morrison immediately requested a list of all visitors to Clarence House during that period. The records showed several official meetings, family visits, and maintenance workers who had been conducting routine repairs in various parts of the building. But there was one name that stood out, a man named James Hartley, who had been listed as a private antiquities consultant, scheduled to appraise some historical items in Camilla's collection. Morrison's instincts told her this was the lead she had been waiting for. She began digging into Hartley's background with renewed focus. What she discovered sent a chill down her spine. James Hartley was indeed a legitimate antiquities dealer with an impressive client list and decades of experience. However, his business had fallen on hard times in recent years. Several valuable pieces he had been hired to appraise for other wealthy clients had mysteriously gone missing shortly after his visits. There had been suspicions, but never enough evidence to bring charges. He was clever, always having alibis, always leaving just enough reasonable doubt to avoid prosecution. Morrison realized she might be dealing with a sophisticated thief who had been operating for years right under everyone's noses. She brought her findings to Camilla, who listened with a mixture of horror and relief. Horror at the thought that she had welcomed a thief into her private rooms, that she had shown him her most precious possessions, while he calculated their worth and planned their theft. Relief because it meant she was not losing her mind, that the items had indeed been stolen, that her memory and judgment were intact. Camilla remembered the visit clearly now. Hartley had been charming, knowledgeable, and had asked to see various items from her personal collection. She had shown him several pieces, including the pearl necklace and her mother's brooch. She had trusted him completely. Detective Morrison explained that proving Hartley's guilt would be challenging. Without physical evidence linking him to the theft, they would need either a confession or to recover the stolen items in his possession. She proposed a plan that was risky, but might be their only chance. They would set a trap, inviting Hartley back to Clarence House under the pretense of appraising additional items, while secretly monitoring his every move and word. Camilla agreed without hesitation. If there was even a small chance of recovering her family's heirlooms, she would take it, no matter the risk or the public exposure that might follow. Preparations for the operation began immediately. Tiny cameras were installed in the rooms where Hartley would be received. Audio equipment was concealed in furniture and decorative items. Undercover officers posed as household staff, ready to observe and intervene if necessary. Camilla rehearsed her role, learning to act naturally while wearing a hidden microphone, knowing that every word would be recorded and analyzed. The night before Hartley's scheduled visit, she barely slept, her mind racing through all the possible outcomes, hoping desperately that this plan would bring her closer to recovering the pieces of her past that had been so cruelly taken from her. The morning of James Hartley's visit arrived with gray skies and a persistent drizzle that matched Camilla's anxious mood. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant outfit that would not attract attention to the small microphone concealed beneath her collar. Her hands shook slightly as she fastened her earrings, replicas of pieces she actually owned, nothing of real sentimental value that could be put at risk. Margaret helped her with final preparations, offering quiet words of encouragement that Camilla barely heard over the pounding of her own heartbeat. Detective Morrison and her team were positioned throughout Clarence House, hidden in plain sight as maintenance workers, catering staff, and security personnel. The surveillance equipment was active and tested multiple times that morning. Every angle of the meeting room had been covered, every word would be captured. Morrison reminded Camilla through a discreet earpiece to act naturally, to treat Hartley as she would any other consultant, to give no indication that anything was amiss. The goal was to make him comfortable enough to potentially reveal something incriminating, or at the very least, to observe his reactions when certain topics were raised. Hartley arrived precisely on time, stepping out of an expensive black car with the confident bearing of someone who had nothing to hide. He was in his early 60s, distinguished-looking with silver hair and an impeccably tailored suit. His smile was warm and genuine as he greeted Camilla, showing no signs of nervousness or guilt. He carried a leather briefcase that presumably contained appraisal tools and documentation. As they shook hands, Camilla felt a surge of anger that she fought to suppress. This man, if the detective was correct, had violated her trust in the most personal way imaginable. Yet here he stood, acting as though they were old friends. They settled into the private sitting room where tea had been arranged on a silver service. Another listening post concealed within the antique sugar bowl. Camilla poured with steady hands, years of public appearances having taught her how to maintain composure under pressure. She made small talk about the weather, recent charity events, anything to establish a comfortable atmosphere. Hartley responded with ease, complimenting the room's furnishings and sharing amusing anecdotes about other clients he had worked with. He was, Camilla had to admit, exceptionally charming. She could see how easily someone might trust him completely. As they finished their tea, Camilla led Hartley to a display cabinet where she kept various items she wanted appraised for insurance purposes. This was the official reason for his visit, carefully constructed to seem legitimate. She showed him several pieces: antique snuff boxes, decorative fans from the Victorian era, a collection of commemorative coins. Hartley examined each item with professional interest, discussing their historical significance and estimated values. His knowledge was impressive and seemed genuine. Morrison and her team listened intently through their headphones, waiting for any slip, any indication of guilt. Then Camilla took a calculated risk, steering the conversation toward the missing jewelry. She mentioned casually that she had been reorganizing her personal collection recently and had been surprised to discover several family pieces she had forgotten she owned. She watched Hartley's face carefully for any reaction. For just a moment, barely a flicker, something changed in his expression. It was subtle, a slight tension around his eyes, a pause before he responded that lasted a fraction of a second too long. But he recovered quickly, expressing polite interest and asking what she had found. Camilla described pieces similar to those that had been stolen, watching him like a hawk. Hartley leaned forward, his interest appearing genuine. He asked detailed questions about the pieces she described, their provenance, their condition, whether they had ever been professionally appraised before. His questions were exactly what a legitimate dealer would ask, but there was something in his tone, an eagerness that seemed to go beyond professional curiosity. Camilla felt her suspicion solidify. This man knew something about her missing heirlooms. She could sense it in the way he leaned closer when she spoke about family jewelry, in the subtle intensity of his gaze when she mentioned pearls and sapphires. Detective Morrison, listening from an adjacent room, felt the same certainty. She signaled to her team to be ready to move if necessary. Through the surveillance cameras, she watched Hartley's body language, noting the slight increase in his breathing rate, the way his fingers drummed once against his knee when Camilla mentioned a pearl necklace. These were small tells, nothing that would hold up in court by themselves, but they confirmed her theory. Now they needed to push harder, to see if they could provoke a more definitive response that might lead them to the stolen items. Camilla continued her act, mentioning that she was considering having her entire collection photographed and cataloged for security purposes. She said she had been concerned about the safety of her pieces, especially after hearing about thefts from other prominent homes in the area. Hartley's expression remained neutral, but his posture had become slightly defensive, his shoulders tense. He advised her that proper documentation was indeed wise, that many valuable items went missing simply because owners did not have adequate records of what they owned. His words were reasonable, but there was an undercurrent that suggested he knew more than he was saying. The meeting continued for another hour, with Hartley completing his appraisals of the items Camilla had shown him. He provided written estimates, discussed insurance recommendations, and maintained his professional demeanor throughout. As the visit drew to a close, Camilla walked him to the door, thanking him for his time and expertise. Hartley promised to send a detailed report within the week, and expressed his hope that they might work together again in the future. As she watched his car disappear down the drive, Camilla felt exhausted but also energized. They had learned something today, even if it was not a confession. The investigation was far from over. Detective Morrison reviewed the recordings immediately, her team analyzing every word, every gesture, every micro-expression captured by the hidden cameras. While they had not obtained a smoking gun, they had gathered valuable information about Hartley's reactions and responses. More importantly, they now had his voice and mannerisms on record, which could be useful for future investigations. Morrison was more convinced than ever that Hartley was their thief, but she also knew that conviction alone would not recover Camilla's heirlooms. They needed a new strategy, one that would force Hartley's hand or lead them directly to where he had hidden the stolen pieces. In the days following Hartley's visit, Detective Morrison's team launched a comprehensive surveillance operation. They tracked his movements, monitored his phone calls, and investigated his business transactions. What they discovered painted a picture of a man living well beyond what his legitimate business income could support. He maintained an expensive flat in Mayfair, drove luxury cars, and frequented exclusive clubs where membership alone cost more than most people earned in a year. Yet his business records showed declining revenues and mounting debts. The discrepancy was glaring, suggesting income from sources he was not reporting, sources that were likely illegal. Morrison obtained a warrant to examine Hartley's financial records more closely. The investigation revealed a complex network of transactions involving offshore accounts and shell companies. Money moved through these accounts in patterns that suggested someone trying to hide the proceeds of illegal activities. There were deposits that coincided with dates shortly after reported thefts from various wealthy homes, though proving a direct connection remained challenging. Hartley had been very careful, never leaving a clear paper trail that could definitively link him to any specific crime. It was frustrating work, like trying to grab smoke with bare hands. Meanwhile, Camilla struggled with her daily routines, finding it difficult to focus on her royal duties while knowing that the man who had stolen her family's treasures was out there, free and unpunished. Charles noticed her distraction during official events. The way her smile seemed forced, how she would touch her throat absently where the pearl necklace should have rested. He suggested she take some time away from public life to rest and recover, but Camilla refused. She felt that stopping her work would be like admitting defeat, allowing the thief to steal not just her possessions but her sense of purpose as well. Laura visited her mother frequently during this period, bringing her children along to provide distraction and joy. The grandchildren would run through the gardens, their laughter echoing off the old stone walls, reminding Camilla that family was more than objects and heirlooms. Yet even as she played with the children, reading them stories and helping them build elaborate fairy houses among the roses, a part of her mind remained focused on the missing jewelry. She found herself wondering if her grandmother's pearls would ever grace another generation's wedding day, or if they were lost forever to some private collection where their true meaning would never be known. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Morrison's junior investigators, while researching Hartley's known associates, discovered a connection to an antiques dealer named Marcus Sullivan, who operated a small shop in Bath. Sullivan had a reputation for handling items of questionable provenance, pieces that wealthy collectors wanted to acquire, without asking too many questions about their origins. Phone records showed several calls between Hartley and Sullivan in the weeks following the theft from Clarence House. Morrison felt a surge of excitement. This could be the connection they needed. She dispatched undercover officers to Bath, posing as wealthy collectors interested in acquiring unique pieces for their private collection. They visited Sullivan's shop, a dimly lit establishment tucked away on a side street, its windows displaying an eclectic mix of furniture, paintings, and decorative objects. Sullivan himself was a nervous, thin man with sharp eyes that constantly darted toward the door, as if expecting trouble to walk in at any moment. He was cautious with the undercover officers at first, showing them only items with legitimate documentation. Building his trust would take time and patience. Over several weeks, the undercover team made repeat visits to Sullivan's shop, gradually establishing themselves as serious buyers with deep pockets and few scruples about provenance. They purchased several items, always paying in cash, never asking difficult questions. Sullivan slowly began to relax around them, eventually hinting that he had access to more exclusive pieces that were not on public display, items that certain collectors would pay premium prices for. No questions asked. The officers expressed strong interest, and Sullivan promised to contact them when something special became available. The trap was being set, and now they had to wait for the right moment to spring it. Camilla was informed of these developments, and for the first time in months, she felt a genuine spark of hope. The possibility that her heirlooms might actually be recovered seemed more real than it had since the day she discovered them missing. Morrison cautioned her not to get her hopes too high, explaining that even if they could connect Sullivan to the stolen jewelry, actually retrieving the pieces might prove difficult. Items like these could change hands quickly in the underground market, passed from dealer to collector and back again, each transaction making them harder to trace. But Camilla refused to let pessimism dampen her renewed optimism. She allowed herself to imagine holding her grandmother's pearls again, feeling their weight in her hands, knowing they were safely back where they belonged. The waiting was agonizing. Days turned into weeks with no word from Sullivan. The undercover team maintained their cover, occasionally visiting the shop to keep the relationship warm, but always careful not to appear too eager or suspicious. They purchased other items, small antiques and curiosities, building their credibility as collectors. Behind the scenes, Morrison's technical team monitored Sullivan's communications, hoping for any mention of the royal heirlooms or contact with Hartley. The surveillance yielded little of immediate use, but it confirmed that Sullivan was indeed dealing in stolen goods, receiving calls from various sources about pieces that needed to be moved quickly and quietly. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, Sullivan finally made contact. He called one of the undercover officers, his voice barely above a whisper, saying he had acquired something extraordinary, a collection of antique jewelry from an aristocratic family, pieces of exceptional quality and historical significance. He could not discuss details over the phone, but if they were interested, he could arrange a private viewing. The officer played it cool, expressing casual interest while agreeing to meet. As soon as the call ended, the team sprang into action. alerting Morrison and preparing for what might be their best chance to recover Camilla's stolen heirlooms. Morrison immediately contacted Camilla with the news, cautioning her that they could not be certain these were her pieces until they had seen them firsthand. But the timing and description matched perfectly with what they had expected. They discussed the next steps carefully. The undercover officers would attend the viewing, wearing hidden cameras and recording devices. If the items proved to be Camilla's stolen heirlooms, they would need to move quickly to secure them, while also gathering enough evidence to arrest both Sullivan and Hartley. It was a delicate operation that required perfect timing and coordination. One mistake could spook Sullivan, sending the jewelry underground where it might never be found again. The private viewing was scheduled for Thursday evening at Sullivan's shop after regular business hours. Detective Morrison assembled her best team for the operation, going over every detail multiple times. The undercover officers would wear sophisticated recording equipment hidden in their clothing, small cameras disguised as buttons and cufflinks that would capture everything they saw. A surveillance van would be parked nearby, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Additional officers were positioned at various points around the block, prepared to move quickly if needed. The operation had been planned with military precision, but Morrison knew that even the best plans could fall apart when confronted with unpredictable human behavior. Camilla insisted on being nearby during the operation, despite Morrison's strong objections. She wanted to be close when her heirlooms were potentially recovered, feeling that she owed it to her grandmother and mother to be present at this crucial moment. A compromise was reached where Camilla would wait in an unmarked vehicle several streets away, accompanied by Margaret and a security detail. She would be far enough from the action to remain safe, but close enough to respond quickly if the stolen items were confirmed to be hers. As Thursday evening approached, Camilla found herself unable to eat or concentrate. Her entire being focused on the upcoming operation. The undercover officers, introducing themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Richardson, arrived at Sullivan's shop precisely at the appointed time. Sullivan greeted them nervously, repeatedly checking the street before locking the door behind them and drawing the curtains. The shop, dimly lit by a few strategically placed lamps, took on an almost sinister atmosphere in the evening gloom. Sullivan led them to a back room, a cluttered space filled with wrapped packages and items awaiting restoration. On a table covered with black velvet, he had arranged a stunning collection of jewelry that gleamed under a single overhead light. The female officer felt her breath catch as she looked at the display. Even without expertise in antique jewelry, she could see that these pieces were extraordinary. A strand of lustrous pearls lay coiled like a sleeping snake. A sapphire brooch caught the light, throwing blue fire across the dark velvet. Several rings, including what appeared to be an antique cameo, were arranged in a careful row. A gold locket rested at the center of the display, its surface engraved with delicate patterns. Sullivan watched their reactions carefully, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he saw their genuine interest. The officer moved closer, examining the pieces with the appreciative eye of a knowledgeable collector, while her hidden camera captured every detail. She picked up the pearl necklace, feeling its weight, noting the quality of the individual pearls and the antique clasp. She asked about provenance, and Sullivan provided a vague story about an elderly aristocrat who needed to sell family pieces discreetly due to financial difficulties. It was a common cover story in the trade, plausible enough to provide deniability while everyone involved understood the truth remained unspoken. The officer nodded, asking about price, while her partner examined the other pieces with similar careful attention. In the surveillance van, Morrison watched the feed from the hidden cameras, her heart racing as she studied the jewelry. She had memorized the descriptions Camilla had provided, studied the few photographs that existed of the missing pieces. What she was seeing now matched those descriptions perfectly. The distinctive pattern of the pearl necklace, slightly graduated in size with a unique diamond-studded clasp. The sapphire brooch with its surrounding halo of small diamonds, one tiny stone visibly missing from the setting, exactly as Camilla had described. There could be no doubt. These were the stolen royal heirlooms. Morrison spoke quietly into her radio, alerting her team to prepare to move in on her signal. Several streets away, Camilla sat forward in her vehicle, her hand pressed against the window as if she could somehow see through the buildings to where her treasures waited. Margaret held her other hand, offering silent support. The wait was excruciating, each minute feeling like an hour. Camilla found herself praying, something she rarely did, asking whatever powers might listen to please let this work, to please bring her family's history back to her. She thought of her grandmother's face in old photographs, imagined her mother's joy if she could know that her precious things might soon be recovered. The emotional weight of the moment pressed down on her like a physical force. Back in the shop, Sullivan quoted a price that made the undercover officers pause convincingly, as if considering whether the investment was worthwhile. They asked if they could examine the pieces more closely, photograph them for their records, the usual requests of serious buyers. Sullivan agreed, relaxing now that the sale seemed certain. The male officer took out his phone, ostensibly to take photographs but actually triggering a signal that would alert Morrison's team that positive identification had been made. The pieces were confirmed as stolen royal property. It was time to move. Everything happened quickly after that. Morrison gave the signal, and within seconds officers were at the shop's doors, front and back. They announced themselves loudly, demanding entry. Sullivan's face went white with shock and fear as he realized what was happening. He looked at the two buyers, understanding dawning in his eyes that he had been deceived. He made a desperate lunge for the jewelry, perhaps thinking he could hide it or destroy evidence. But the undercover officers were faster, restraining him while protecting the pieces on the table. The door burst open and Morrison strode in with additional officers, immediately securing the scene. Sullivan was arrested on the spot, read his rights while officers photographed the jewelry, and began documenting everything in the room. Sullivan, realizing his situation was hopeless, began talking immediately, offering information in exchange for leniency. He confirmed that James Hartley had brought him the pieces several months earlier, asking him to find a buyer. Sullivan had been waiting for the right opportunity, knowing that jewelry of this quality and distinctiveness required a very particular kind of customer, someone willing to pay premium prices for pieces that could never be displayed publicly or traced back to their new owner. He provided details about other transactions with Hartley, information that would prove invaluable in building a case against the antiquities dealer. Morrison carefully gathered the jewelry, placing each piece in evidence bags while photographing them from multiple angles. Even through the plastic, the pieces seemed to glow with their own inner light, beautiful objects that had witnessed decades of family history. She contacted Camilla immediately, her voice betraying her excitement despite her professional demeanor. The pieces had been recovered. They were safe. After months of investigation and heartbreak, the royal heirlooms were finally coming home. She could hear Camilla's sharp intake of breath over the phone, followed by tears, joyful tears that spoke of relief and gratitude too deep for words. Within the hour, Morrison arrived at Camilla's location with the recovered jewelry. Even sealed in evidence bags, even under the harsh light of the vehicle's interior, the pieces were unmistakable. Camilla reached out with trembling hands, touching the plastic that enclosed her grandmother's pearls, tears streaming down her face unchecked. Margaret wept beside her, sharing in the emotional release of this moment. Years of family history, generations of love and tradition had been restored in an instant. The objects themselves were precious, but what they represented was beyond any monetary value. They were proof that some connections cannot be broken, that family bonds transcend time and circumstance, that what truly matters can survive even the most devastating loss. The arrest of James Hartley took place 3 days after the recovery of the jewelry, giving investigators time to gather additional evidence and coordinate with multiple law enforcement agencies. Officers arrived at his Mayfair flat early in the morning, finding him still in his dressing gown, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. The look of shock on his face when they presented their warrant was almost comical. His carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbled in an instant as reality crashed through his defenses. He had believed himself untouchable, too clever to ever be caught. But Sullivan's confession and the recovered jewelry had provided more than enough evidence to charge him with multiple counts of theft. The search of Hartley's residence revealed even more stolen property than investigators had anticipated. Hidden in a secure room behind a false wall, they found dozens of items reported missing from various estates over the past decade. There were paintings, rare books, antique silver, and more jewelry, each piece representing someone's loss, someone's severed connection to their past. Among these items, they found documentation that Hartley had meticulously kept, records of every theft he had committed, every item he had stolen, complete with dates, locations, and the amounts he had received when selling them. It was a stunning display of arrogance, keeping records that would ultimately become the evidence of his own guilt. Perhaps he had never truly believed he would be caught, or perhaps the records were a form of pride, a way of keeping score in a game only he knew he was playing. Detective Morrison personally informed Camilla of Hartley's arrest and the extent of his criminal activities. Camilla listened in stunned silence as Morrison described the hidden room, the dozens of stolen items, the lives that had been disrupted by this one man's greed. She felt a strange mixture of emotions, anger at what he had done, relief that he had finally been stopped, and an odd sort of pity for someone who had thrown away his legitimate talents and reputation for illegal gains that could never truly satisfy. She wondered what had driven him to this life, what emptiness he had been trying to fill with stolen treasures that were never truly his to possess. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and drawn out over many months. Hartley initially pleaded not guilty, maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. His lawyers argued that the documentation found in his flat could have been planted, that Sullivan's testimony was unreliable because he was trying to reduce his own sentence, that the entire case was built on circumstantial evidence. But as more victims came forward, as more stolen items were identified and matched to reports from years past, the defense's arguments became increasingly weak. Eventually, faced with the impossibility of acquittal, Hartley changed his plea to guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. The day he was sentenced, Camilla attended court, sitting quietly in the public gallery. She wanted to face the man who had violated her trust, to hear him account for what he had done. Hartley did not look at her directly, keeping his eyes downward as the judge detailed his crimes and their impact on his victims. When given the opportunity to speak, he offered a brief apology that sounded hollow and rehearsed, words without genuine remorse behind them. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison, noting that his abuse of the trust placed in him by his clients represented a particularly egregious form of betrayal. As Hartley was led away in handcuffs, Camilla felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness at the waste of a life, at the damage one person's choices had caused to so many others. With the criminal proceedings concluded, the recovered jewelry could finally be released from evidence and returned to its rightful owner. A small private ceremony was arranged at Clarence's house for the official return of the pieces. Detective Morrison presented each item to Camilla personally, placing them carefully on a velvet cushion as she had seen done in historical ceremonies. Camilla held each piece in turn, examining them closely, reacquainting herself with treasures she had feared were lost forever. The pearls felt cool and smooth in her hands, their luster undiminished by their months away. The sapphire brooch caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, casting small rainbows across the room's walls. The gold locket opened to reveal her father's photograph still safely inside, his gentle smile unchanged by time or circumstance. Laura was present for the ceremony, along with Camilla's other children and several grandchildren. The family gathered around as Camilla told them stories about each piece, sharing memories of the women who had worn them before. The children listened with wide eyes, touching the jewelry carefully when invited, beginning to understand that these were not just beautiful objects but tangible links to ancestors they had never met. Camilla fastened the pearl necklace around Laura's neck, her fingers fumbling slightly with the clasp as emotion overwhelmed her. Laura looked at her reflection in a nearby mirror, tears streaming down her face as she saw herself adorned with the same pearls her grandmother and great-grandmother had worn on their wedding days. The weight of family history rested gently against her collarbone, a promise of continuity and love that transcended individual lifetimes. The press eventually learned about the theft and recovery, though the royal family's communications team worked to minimize the sensational aspects of the story. The official statement focused on gratitude for the excellent police work that had led to the recovery of important family heirlooms and the arrest of a prolific thief who had victimized many families. Details about the emotional toll on Camilla were kept private, protected from public consumption. There was no need for the world to know about the sleepless nights, the doubts, the grief that had consumed her during those long months of loss. Those experiences belonged to her alone, private chapters in a very public life. Other victims of Hartley's thefts began the process of reclaiming their stolen property, each recovery bringing its own emotional reunion. An elderly gentleman from Cornwall was reunited with his late wife's engagement ring, which he had thought was lost forever when she died. A family in Scotland recovered a medieval manuscript that had been in their possession for 400 years. Each item represented more than its monetary value. Each carried stories and memories that no amount of insurance money could replace. Detective Morrison attended many of these returns, finding deep satisfaction in seeing the joy on people's faces as they were reunited with pieces of their personal history. It was, she often thought, the best part of her job. These moments of restoration and healing that made all the difficult investigative work worthwhile. Camilla began wearing the recovered jewelry regularly again, refusing to hide it away in a vault where it would be safe but unseen. She wore the pearl necklace to official dinners, the sapphire brooch to charity galas, the gold locket every day beneath her clothing close to her heart. Each time she clasped these pieces around her neck or pinned them to her jacket, she thought of the women who had worn them before her, feeling their presence and blessing. The jewelry had survived theft and recovery, had been lost and found, and somehow these experiences had made them even more precious. They had proven that some things are worth fighting for, worth grieving over, worth celebrating when returned. They were reminders that family and history mattered, that the past had value in the present, and that love could be held in objects that passed from one generation to the next.